Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Ben Harrison. I am the managing editor of My Jewish Learning, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's discussion entitled, You Want to Do What at My Funeral? Today we have a really wonderful panel who will be joining us to discuss end-of-life issues in situations where a family member is not Jewish, which is a situation that is facing an ever-growing number of Jewish families. Before I go further, I want to take a moment just to thank Riverside Memorial Chapel, our partners in organizing this event today. We're happy to have Sherry Ben-Simon from Riverside Memorial Chapel here with us today. I will introduce our panelists in just a moment, but I did just want to say to everyone who is joining us, we welcome your questions and your comments. Please do share those with us in the chat, and I will remind you a couple times as the discussion unfolds this afternoon, and we will do our best to get as many of those sent up to the panel as we can. And on that note, let me introduce our four panelists who are with us today, beginning with Rabbi Michael Parise, who was born and raised in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. Rabbi Parise, can you give a little wave? Everyone sees who you are. Thank you. From a young age, Rabbi Parise worked in his family's funeral home, Goldstein's, Rosenberg's, Raphael Sachs in Philadelphia.
A law firm.
Where he learned the values of community, public service, and compassion. He's a graduate of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College and currently serves as the senior rabbi at Temple Sinai of Cinnamonson. What a great name. Located in southern New Jersey. Rabbi Parise, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Next up is Rabbi Mia Simring, who was ordained by the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York City. She also holds a certificate in pastoral care and counseling and has focused her rabbinic work on chaplaincy in hospitals, long-term care facilities, and now correctional facilities. She is currently serving as Jewish chaplain for the New York City Department of Correction, working with both pre- and post-trial detainees. Rabbi Simring, thank you for being with us.
Nice to be here.
Next is Rabbi David Levin, who was ordained by Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, and he is the manager of the Jewish Relationships Initiative, a nonprofit organization helping seekers of meaning through Jewish wisdom, focusing on relationships and end-of-life challenges. He teaches nationally on these topics and is the author of Jewish End-of-Life Care in a Virtual Age, Our Traditions Reimagined. Rabbi Levin, thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you for letting me be here today.
And last but not least is Sherry Ben-Simon, a licensed funeral director with Riverside Memorial Chapel. She got her start in funeral work as a longtime volunteer with the Kaddish, the local Jewish Burial Society, and is now vice president of the Metropolitan Funeral Directors Association, a board member of the New York State Funeral Directors Association, and a contributor to Nechama Comfort. Sherry, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So to kick us off today, I want to just go around the horn and have everybody just open by sharing a little bit about their own experience with this topic of navigating the complexities of end-of-life care in an interfaith family situation. If you could tell us a little bit about some experiences that you've had in that regard, and a little bit about how you guide families who are navigating those issues. And again, I want to remind folks who are listening to please share with us your own experiences, your own comments, and your questions, and we will surface those for the panel as we move forward. Rabbi Parise, why don't we start with you?
Thank you. It's a great honor to be here. My family owns Jewish funeral homes in the Philadelphia and New Jersey area. They've been in the funeral home industry since the 1800s. So I was very much at a young age immersed in death and grief. My mother was a certified grief counselor. She's a funeral director. She was my idol growing up. Watching her from a young age when I didn't even really have a connection to a rabbi, she was like my rabbi. And I would hear her on the phone with people and she'd be like, tell me about mom. Tell me about dad. Never tell me about your mom. Never tell me about your dad. Tell me about mom. Tell me about dad. And that had a profound impact on me. I think early on, I realized when you were dealing with families, interfaith families, families of all different kinds of makeups, people in times of grief, there's a lot of sensitivity that needs to go into that. And when I am asked to officiate a ceremony or a service for a family who has a different cultural makeup, I try to find out, who are you doing what for? Who is this for? You've heard things. They say, well, what about this, Rabbi? What about that? And I always explain to them what the traditional Jewish service could look like. But then I ask them, is this for the deceased? Is this for you? Is this because you're trying to please someone? I try to find out what's important to them in this moment so that I can try to craft the most meaningful and respectful service for their loved one. And so doing a lot of that background work of figuring out what the different interests are really important.
Thank you, Rabbi Paris. Rabbi Simmering, how about you?
Sure. So I did my first funeral before I graduated from rabbinical school, and it was a really impactful moment. And then I started getting referrals for funerals for people who didn't have their own rabbis, for unaffiliated people. And this could be interfaith, it could be a whole bunch of things. But in those early days, I got approached for 2 separate funerals for somebody who would be cremated. And there was a big question mark for me at the time as a newly minted conservative rabbi about dealing with this. And in the end, I just considered it to be a memorial ceremony. I didn't do anything really differently from how I would have performed a funeral in any other funeral home. We just didn't have a graveside component. But also I want to keep in mind, and Rabbi Paris, I think you sort of alluded to this, it's not only when a family is interfaith that you start to hear about traditions that are not within a Jewish tradition. It can also be within Jewish families. And I think that recognizing the breadth of people's desires at the end of the life or for their loved ones is within the Jewish context as well. And it's a question of finding out the why, and will it comfort the mourners, or is there other motivation? And I just think it's a lot about asking questions and listening with a compassionate ear.
Thanks, Rabbi Simmering. We are going to get back to the topic of cremation, since I know that is one of the issues that does arise. But before we go there, Rabbi Levin, tell us a little bit about your experience in this area.
Well, for starters, I'm going to echo my colleagues. I think we're of the same, we're cut from the same cloth in many respects. The tradition says we're supposed to do 2 things. We're supposed to honor the dead, which is called kavod, and we're supposed to also comfort the grieving, which is nichum. So this kavod and nichum interaction, sometimes it fits together nicely, but as both Rabbi Paris and Rabbi Simmering are alluding to, our personal needs and our personal understanding of the tradition have to figure out how to get woven into the needs of the folks we're attempting to serve. And that's really important. I have a lot of folks who come to me who are, in my outreach work, come to me by nature unaffiliated with a rabbi or a particular tradition, not necessarily religiously observant, but connected culturally or ethnically. There's an identification with this, and their desire is, the reason why I get brought in is, Rabbi, I want to bury my loved one correctly. I want to offer them the proper respect. How do I do this? So this becomes that intake that was alluded to earlier, that becomes critical for us to listen to what it is they understand, see how we can connect them to the tradition in a meaningful way. And sometimes that takes a bit of a turn. Last week, I did a service at Graveside which included singing the Grateful Dead's Ripple as we interred cremains. Very, very out of the box, I would think, for most rabbis. But you know what? It was completely consistent. I reached out to them and I said, think of the Psalms as poetry. And they were musicians in their family, and the adult children said, well, if we do that, can we use music? Can we use lyrics? And this was a particular song that resonated for them and came not too long after the 23rd Psalm. So I was able to do both. And as Rabbi Mia was referencing, sometimes we feel comfortable, and sometimes we have to violate what we might consider our own personal boundaries or borders in service to them, and that, I think, is the greatest task and the greatest responsibility that is given to us as rabbis in that space.
Thanks, Rabbi Levin. And Sherry, you want to jump in on this?
Yeah. So, my fellow panelists, I'm not a rabbi. But when I started with my local Hever Kaddish, which is translated into Holy Burial Group, at 16, I taught myself over 25 years about the laws and the customs in Judaism of how to take care of the dead. And so that's always been my perspective, regardless of whether I'm dealing with a decedent, someone who's passed away who's Jewish or not. My number one goal is to advocate for that decedent because they can't advocate for themselves. So what I do is, it's interesting because a lot of my families who come to me, okay, at the moment of death, even before death, when they want to prearrange, let's say, a lot of my families are not affiliated. So they're not in contact with any rabbis. Maybe they'll have a cousin or a friend of a friend. But so I see that as an opportunity to educate my families, whether they're interfaith or whether they're totally, we have a lot of families who identify as Jewish and are very proud Jews, but don't believe in God. So I'll give them the reasoning why the correct way that we're all always told, you have to use a plain pine casket and things like that, the etiology of where that came from. And then you choose, according to the education that I've given you, what is meaningful, to you. And so, for instance, a couple weeks ago, I had a gentleman who passed away, very, very proud Jewish man. But over the years, being that he was in his late 90s, he was no longer affiliated with a temple or a rabbi. His daughter, who had converted to Christianity, wanted everything the Jewish way, quote unquote. In that, she also wanted embalming. So I said to her, let me just educate you what, the reason why as Jews, we don't traditionally embalm, and why traditionally, again, I'm a funeral director, so I'm well-rounded and I understand other faiths. And so I explained to her why the Christian families believe in embalming. It's sacred to them as well. And so with that education and with that understanding of, the etiology on both sides, she made an informed decision as to what would be best, not just for her, but for her father, who ultimately, again, I was advocating for. And if she had wanted embalming, it doesn't matter if that I'm a Jewish funeral director. I'll do whatever it is the family wants, but it's important to me that they are educated and make that proper, decisions based on that education.
Thanks, Sherry. So let's tuck into some of the specifics around issues that arise with respect to interfaith funerals and end-of-life planning, excuse me. I'm looking at the panel. And I'll just remind folks again, we'd love to hear your questions and your comments and your experiences as well. Please drop those in the chat and we will surface those as best we can. Just to sort of set the scene a little bit more specifically, I'm wondering if each of you could speak to the specific questions that come up when interfaith families are facing the question of how to plan a funeral. And maybe we'll start in reverse order this time. Sherry, do you want to jump in on this one?
I get that a lot. More often than not, I get a husband and wife where the spouse that's alive and making the arrangements for their deceased spouse, she or he is not Jewish, but they want to do everything again the right way, right? So I have to think ahead because, a great deal of Jewish families have, from their grandfathers or great grandfathers, graves that were set aside for future generations, but in Jewish cemeteries. So I'll say to the spouse, we'll do everything that you'd like me to do, and we'll sit together and we'll see what it is that's meaningful to that spouse for her husband or wife. But I'll say to them, please understand that you also have to think of the future. When the time comes, as Jews, we say, may you live to 120. I say that to my non-Jewish families too. At 120, when you pass away, where do you want to be buried? Or will you be cremated? Because I need you to understand that particular section of the Jewish cemetery, you will not be allowed to be buried in. And that's not according to me and not according to New York state law. It's according to that Jewish cemetery and their bylaws. So I have to be educated to other Jewish cemeteries that may have non-sectarian sections or sections specifically put aside for interfaith couples. So, I get this question probably weekly. And when I get this question before someone passes away, first of all, I get excited because I'm so glad that people are self-educating before the time so that they can make informed decisions on behalf of their future family members who will be the survivors. But also the husband and wife or the father and the child or whatever it is, they could discuss within themselves what's meaningful to them and where ultimately they want to be buried. And so that way they could be visited by the children and grandchildren and such.
Thanks, Sherry. So burial of non-Jewish family members in Jewish cemeteries clearly is an issue that's coming up. What are some of the other questions that folks are getting? Rabbi Levin, can you share some other things that are commonly asked of you?
I think that question that Sherry addressed is really very important, and knowing whether or not you can be buried in the cemetery next to your loved one is an issue, which, again, if you leave that conversation to after the fact, it becomes a much more difficult thing and the options become limited. So knowing beforehand, I usually find myself in a space where people are, again, looking to do the right thing, but are clueless as to what the right thing is. So a tremendous amount of my time has been spent in educating. And actually, I'm not going to limit that to just non-Jews. I did a funeral 2 or 3 weeks ago where I had everybody from black hats up from Brooklyn, or down from Brooklyn, where we're in Philadelphia, to the non-Jewish spouse. And it was a difficult thing to do, but what I ended up doing is spending time before the funeral started to visit with the community that came from Brooklyn to pay their respects. I spent time with the brother-in-law who was the religious connection. And I spent a lot of time privately with the non-Jewish spouse to let her understand what was going to happen and why it was going to happen. And based on the conversations we've had, this is how I plan on weaving it. And I also, by the way, in terms of being creative, offered her to wear a Kriya ribbon so that she too felt fully included, as well as the more observant members of the family. And that funeral director walked away saying, I was kind of expecting an explosion and somehow or another you diffused it. I'm not sure what you did. But to me, that was the hallmark of a successful moment where each member of the family got a chance to be heard, felt affirmed, and also felt included in the process.
Thanks, Rabbi Levin. Rabbi Simmering.
Sure. So this conversation has reminded me of a time I was working in an ICU pre-COVID. There was a young man who was in the end stages of a chronic disease that he'd been born with. He was adopted from overseas by a Southern Christian family, had ended up in New York City. I think his boyfriend or ex-boyfriend was Jewish, and he had become interested in Judaism. but because of his chronic disease was never able to convert like he had started on a conversion path. And there was a question of, can we say Kaddish if he is not Jewish, if we are not Jewish? And luckily he was affiliated with a synagogue here in New York, but in that moment, when they really wanted to get things right and know what was about to happen and what could be said, being given permission to participate in a holy act, even though the reality was they probably weren't going to get themselves through the Aramaic words, being part of a group saying Kaddish was meaningful. And this comes up over and over again. Can you say Kaddish for a non-Jewish friend, spouse, etc.? Yes. If you are Jewish, then yes. Can a non-Jewish person say Kaddish? We don't regulate what other people let come out of their mouths. And it's a really beautiful thing to participate in, just like Kriya. And I think in some ways we're really lucky that there are so many entry points to end of life ritual and care. And there's more minhag or custom than there is halacha. So I think that is really wonderful. And I'm going to just say another thing about hospital experience, which was in the case of a single Jewish person who had zero family of any religion, there was somebody who approached me about the view of donating a body to science. Mm-hmm. So I had to look that one up. And I looked all over. It's not a simple situation. And I came back with my research and I said, let me just ask you why you would like to do it. And she said, I have no money and I have no family. And I said, okay, I think it's really wonderful that you want to support scientific research, but it doesn't sound like that's the reason. Do you know that there are resources for people in your situation to still have a Jewish burial? And just educating about that gave her a ton of comfort. So she still had all of the options open to her, but just to know that she could go with a very traditional route, independent of her financial status, and that she had nobody kind of to remember her, I think made her feel more part of the community in that moment.
Great. Thank you for that, Rabbi Simmering. The question of Kaddish also comes up for us a lot, so thank you for addressing that. Rabbi Priest, I'm going to put a more specific question to you because they're beginning to come in fast and furious in the chat, and a lot of people have some very specific questions, so thank you all for that, everyone. And the one I'll toss your way, Rabbi Priest, is about tattoos. This one comes from Paula, who writes...
I'm really glad this is coming in. There was something I was going to say. Go ahead.
Wonderful. So the question from Paula is that some are appalled that I have a tattoo of our son who died. He was 28. And my son also had tattoos. How do you communicate the more recent acceptance of these practices so no one is judgmental? And I assume that question is also coming up in this context because there is a view out there that many people have that if you have a tattoo somehow that stands in the way.
So let's start there.
So go ahead.
We need to demystify the funeral process. And the first thing we have to do is stop thinking of rabbis as gatekeepers. Because there's not a day that goes by that people don't come to me, Rabbi, I have a tattoo. Can I be buried in a Jewish cemetery? And I say to them, who do you think is checking? I don't say it in this way, but in my mind, I'm like, who do you think is checking bodies to make sure people can go into Jewish cemeteries? Number one, I hate to say it, a lot of Jewish cemeteries are owned by corporations. Mm-hmm. They don't, they're not checking. Jewish funeral homes are there to serve Jewish families. They're not checking. So we as rabbis are not gatekeepers. And a lot of these myths are part of cultural things that have been built up over the years. But what I tell families is you're okay. I explain to them a little bit about the history, about where some of these cultural taboos come from, how they have evolved, how they are changing. But the most important thing is that they know that they absolutely can have a Jewish ceremony and be buried in a Jewish cemetery. That is not something that's going to be kept from them because they have a tattoo.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate you clarifying that for everyone. We have a couple questions coming in about the practice of keeping Jewish burial plots separate. There's actually two related questions. I'll maybe link them together. One is about whether Reform congregations allow interfaith plots. And more generally, Patty asks a question which I'm actually curious about myself, which is, what is the thinking about burying a Jew in a secular, non-Jewish cemetery? What is the Jewish perspective on that? Does anybody want to pick up on one or both of those? Sherry, go ahead.
So there are a lot of sections, Reform sections in Jewish cemeteries that their bylaws do allow for interfaith couples to be buried there. And so it's just like with Rabbi Paris, what he said, who's checking, right? I mean, yes, as a Jewish funeral director and as the rabbis who I engage, or the rabbis who are part of the families, we do ethically stay honest, but just know that that is an option. So if you do want to purchase graves, on those lots and those sections in Reform temples where they own those large swaths of land in Jewish cemeteries, that's definitely an option. Mm-hmm. With regard to burying in a non-sectarian cemetery, Rabbi Simmering said, she alluded to the fact that most of what's going on with the Jewish burial practice and such is minhag, it's custom. It's not halacha, which is like black and white. So there's the beauty of us as Jews is that we're so adaptable. We pivot as necessary. And so, there's nothing wrong. Yes, you try your best to be buried with your fellow kin. But if not, that's fine too.
Does anybody else want to jump in on that question of Jewish burial in a non-Jewish cemetery? Rabbi Levin? Oh, or Rabbi Paris?
No, I'm actually interested in hearing what Rabbi Paris has to share.
Sorry, thank you, Rabbi Levin. No, I literally about a week ago, I was contacted to do a service. The gentleman died. He was Jewish. All his Jewish relatives had already passed. His wife was not Jewish, and all that was remained was her side of the family. And he was already being buried in a non-Jewish cemetery, in a Christian cemetery. By the time it got to me, all this was already set. So I could say as a rabbi, no, I'm not going to do the service. And then who knows where they could end up, or what care would be taken for this person's soul, this Jewish soul. I mean, that's how I see it. This person had a Jewish soul, whether you believe that or not, I do. And I was not going to disrespect this person in this situation because he wasn't being buried in a Jewish cemetery. So I absolutely did the service. I absolutely said Kaddish. The more complicating fact was when the family asked me, should we sit Shiva for him? That was a little more complicated because they're not Jewish. And what could they do? They're not commanded to sit Shiva. And I wanted someone to sit Shiva for the deceased, for the person who passed. So it was kind of a conversation about how do you honor him during this next week? What feels right to you without having to think they have to live Jewishly for a week? So it is, as Sherry said, it's so adaptable. It's so important to remember that we are doing this for the dignity of people, mm-hmm. not for ourselves. This is for the dignity of people, not for our own beliefs and ideologies. And that's really hard. It's really hard to get past that, especially when you're new in the rabbinate or you're new as a funeral director. You don't want to do anything wrong. You don't want to look like you're making mistakes, but it's an important fact to remember. Sorry, David.
Rabbi Levin, you want to get on that?
No, I actually love what he said. There's not much more to add to that because that's Jewish wisdom at its best, I think. Really, people die. One of the very first things in terms of minhag that we're supposed to do when we go to a community is establish a cemetery. And that's one of the very first, so that there is this place where we can go. Is it consecrated ground? Yes. Can you consecrate other ground and hallow it in a way that honors a person if there's not a Jewish cemetery? Of course. And Rabbi Paris just showed us how that gets done beautifully. And I love the idea that, what would Shiva look like for a non-Jewish family trying to honor a Jewish person from that family? That's our responsibility to figure out. One of the few things I'm trying to, Rabbi Paris, you're familiar with West Laurel Hill Cemetery. There are a few Jewish sections now, and as the Jewish community is continuing to grow here, we're having more. And, there are boundaries that are set up to make them distinctive. There are Jews who were buried in that place before the Jewish section got created. The only identifiable difference is there is a place to wash at the outside of the boundary, which leads you into the Jewish space to help you retain an element of ritual purity. And the other thing is that oftentimes on Shabbat, you're not supposed to go to the cemetery, so the gates are normally closed in a Jewish place. But I have, like Rabbi Paris, I've had the honor to officiate funerals for people who need to be honored. And that's the only thing that is my motivator. And that's the thing that's got to guide us. And then taking our wisdom, as Rabbi Paris said again, we're not gatekeepers. We're actually lamplighters along their path. And if we take that perspective as to what it is that we're doing, now we're engaged in holy work. We're not the keepers of the flame. Or we are keepers of the flame in a much more creative way than just saying, yeah, you can only do it this way.
Thanks, Rabbi Levin. Again, some really interesting questions are coming in. We have one here from Hillel Cohn about music, which is traditionally, my understanding, not done at Jewish weddings. At Jewish funerals. But there is a family that apparently wants Amazing Grace at the funeral, which is clearly a Christian song. They want it to be part of the funeral. If it's not sung, perhaps with recorded music as a prelude. Rabbi Simmering, what do you think about that idea?
So I think what's interesting is there is sacred music that happens at funerals, and there are cantors that attend funerals. So I think my question would be sort of why specifically Amazing Grace? But probably the answer is it is a beautiful, moving song that a lot of people can sort of associate emotionally with this moment of loss and of honoring somebody. I think that, as Rabbi Levin said, when there's the case of a musician, it's not unusual to have secular music at a funeral at all. I think that I think having at least the first verse of Amazing Grace, I'm not familiar with all of the verses. I know it's more than one. There's a kind of universal monotheistic tone that I don't think would be out of place at a Jewish funeral. So that's what I would.
Thank you. Sorry, questions keep coming in. I'm not sorry, I'm happy, but I'm going to try to move at a little bit of a faster clip. There are two questions about identification of someone as Jewish, which of course we all know is an issue for the Jews who are alive, but is also an issue when someone dies as well. Two questions. One is about proof. How do you prove that someone is Jewish, either through matrilineal descent or through approved conversion? And a related question from Kimberly about an interesting hypothetical, which I hadn't thought of, is what happens at the time of burial if it is discovered that the deceased is not Jewish and is about to be interred in a Jewish section? Sherry, I have a feeling you've dealt with both of these issues.
Very much so. So, I love what Rabbi Paris said. We're not gatekeepers. So this person lived as a Jew, and how am I supposed to know whether or not they were converted in a proper way, quote unquote, right? So I don't know who the rabbi was, that put them through that, all the necessary steps and all the things they had to do. If this is a human being who I know from their family members, whether they be Jewish or not Jewish, if this is a human being I know that, lived as a Jew, I'm now remembering a wonderful man named Manny. Of course, I only knew him post-death, but I knew so much of him, through his friends and family, who he converted to Judaism. Now, I don't know if he converted the quote unquote halachic or right way. It doesn't matter to me because he lived as a Jew. He contributed to his local temple. He, all of his friends and coworkers and his cousins and aunts and everyone, they all knew he was Jewish, even though he came from a very, very Catholic background, South American background. And he was a very, very proud Jewish man. Now, to me, he's Jewish. I'm a funeral director. Okay, I'm a Jewish funeral director. If I were to sit with him if Manny were to have sat next to me and said to me, "Hey, Sherry, I converted," that's wonderful. I'm not going to ask you which rabbi converted you. You're my kin. You are a part of me. And not just that, you are a fellow human being. So if you've lived your life as a Jew, okay, then that's all I need. And I do the best I can to fulfill that, right? There's what proof can we possibly have, whether or not someone's Jewish,
Rabbi Simmering?
Yeah, I just want to add, since I actually heard about a situation where the opposite was true, where after someone's death, it was found with research that the lineage happened to be a converso family and that they were ethnically Jewish, as well as some members had converted to Judaism. So there was the question, and the decision was it was more disrespectful to disturb the dead from their grave in this situation than to leave them where they were. They lived as a Catholic. That was what they knew. And I think similarly, we have to consider, again, kavod hamet, honoring the dead. Can we do that if we're saying even in death, we're going to gatekeep again and disturb your body to make sure it's in the exact proper section? So I think it's, people may have different opinions about conversion with regards to marriage then, but I think at the end of one's life, that's not really the time to focus on in-group, out-group.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I said we would get back to the issue of cremation, and we have a couple of questions on that topic, and I want to make sure we have enough time to get everyone to jump in on this. So I'm going to read something that was written by one of our viewers from Lori, and get everyone's input on this. I always thought I would follow traditional Jewish burial. However, I don't feel comfortable taking up space on the earth as its resources are more and more limited. I like the idea of better forests, wherein your ashes are buried at a specific tree with a plaque and the forests are then preserved and maintained. Supporting preservation of forests rather than taking up precious space feels right to me. But as a Jew, I struggle with cremation. Thoughts? Sherry, very quick with the hand. We'll start with you.
Yeah, so I get this a lot. This is a scientific point of view, okay? The end result of ashes, okay, they're non-nutritive to the forest that you want to contribute to, right? So if you go ahead and you have a pot of earth mixed in with those ashes, and you put in a little tree, that tree will die. It's non-nutritive. So it's a misnomer for a lot of people who think, that they are going to scatter their ashes and preserve, nature. It's a misnomer, unfortunately. So that's the scientific answer. Combustion reaction and all that good stuff. You guys can look it up. So that's my answer, the scientific answer. The Jewish answer, from, again, I'm not a rabbi, but this is from, over 2 decades of studying, is that in Judaism, we're told over and over again, it's redundant in Torah that we should be burying. And so Torah is not usually redundant unless it's very important. But if it's important to you to cremate, because hey, I'm a funeral director, I'll do whatever you want me to do. But just do it in an educated way where it's not based on being green or anything like that. Because again, the whole process of cremation the burning and all that is bad for the environment and the air. No matter how many filters you put in a crematory, you're also using fossil fuels, and then the end result is those ashes are not non-nutritive. So that's my answer to that.
Someone is jumping in, and we'll just, I don't want to take this in an ecological direction too far, but someone else is also asking about human composting. But when we get to that, I want to give the other panelists a chance to weigh in on the cremation issue, because I think that's very relevant for a lot of folks. Rabbi Levin, looks like you.
Sure. I'm gonna start off. I want to talk a little bit about minhag, because we've talked about that. You know, we have been practicing a variety of things for a long time. When we were in the Middle East, if folks remember, as I recollect, Jacob was probably mummified before his body was returned to the land of his forefathers so he could be buried with his kin. So we've had ossuaries where we've allowed bodies to decompose and the bones were placed in a box and then permanently placed in the catacomb. We have been doing this, but arguably, yes, with 7 billion people in the world, cremation is something that might arguably be part of an alternative. Cremation, from a history perspective, Reform Jews started to practice it. There was a bit of pushback from Roman times, because apparently Romans did do it. And one of the things that we liked to do was not be like the Romans. There's a lot of history there. Reform Jews picked it back up in the 19th century, and Orthodoxy pushed back against that as they were struggling to try and understand and identify what it meant to be Jewish. So in terms of, if you looked at Reform Responsa, there is no halachic prohibition per se against cremation, but there's a lot of minhag against cremation. And of course, with a Holocaust, with a Holocaust overlay as part of our history, there's a lot of pushback against that. But I will tell you that in the cremation space, one of the most moving moments that my wife has ever experienced was at Medanek. She was with an Israeli family whose father was cremated so that he could have his ashes brought to that place where his family was. I'm hard pressed to tell you that that's not a sacred expression. The only thing that I would suggest to you to sort of change the topic ever so slightly from cremation or about cremation, Neil deGrasse Tyson, the astrophysicist, comes out against cremation, specifically because he talks about what Sherry is talking about, that the idea that, I'd rather just quote him actually, "I would request that my body in death be buried, not cremated, so that the energy content contained within gets returned to the earth so the flora and the fauna can dine upon it, just as I have dined upon the flora and the fauna during my lifetime." He's not Jewish, but it sounds like Jewish wisdom in the best of senses. So cremation isn't necessarily prohibited. There are, I think, other alternatives that are available, but we can't just poo-poo it and dismiss it out of hand.
Mm-hmm. So I want to pick up on that last comment, because we have, I think this topic of conversation has prompted a number of questions about more ecological burials. And so I'd like to ask Rabbi Priest and Rabbi Simmering to just pop in on that, and specifically, I'll read it real quickly. We had a question about human composting and a natural funeral, green burials where the body is left to decompose in nature. What's the Jewish perspective on new technology? I don't even know what this is. Maybe some of you do, of natural burial, such as water cremation. So these are all, I think, people who are thinking more in an ecological realm. Rabbi Priest, what do you have to say on that?
There is a burgeoning field of ecological ways of burial, some that I don't even know have been practiced yet, but I've seen and read about, like underwater burials, and there's a whole variety. Some of them are being done in Europe, but But what I would say is that do your research. If being ecologically friendly is important to you, I know Rabbi Levin mentioned earlier a cemetery in Philadelphia that has a green section where people are put right into the earth. It's just that is part of the natural process. I don't see anything in Judaism that would be against that. So I would do your research. There's a lot of this stuff that's out there that I have not personally encountered, so I can't say what I would do in any specific setting because some of it seems theoretical to me. But the green sections at cemeteries are tried and true. And I absolutely think that's a positive thing and things Jewish families could explore.
So I'll also echo that a lot of this is very new and would require, on my part, also more research. I know I have a veterinarian friend who runs a euthanasia program and has been looking into that in Colorado for pets. And that was how I learned about it. I think the theory is very good. I'm also concerned about the environment, and I think Judaism in general is concerned about the environment. I think that there's this idea of being back to the earth. This is critical. And when you go to Israel to a burial, the body is just in a shroud and in the earth, which is very moving to see, although it is a little jarring when you're not used to it. A lot of it depends on the laws of your location also. So I think there's a lot to consider. I will say that I would say Judaism probably advises against just leaving the body out to the elements fully, that it's considered more respectful to sort of surround the body in earth and have it decompose, I guess, more slowly, not cause a stink that many people will be repulsed by, that these processes have to happen, but that they happen in sort of a more contained way.
Thank you. Sherry, you want to jump in?
If I could just add to that, as you mentioned in the beginning, I'm part of my local Metropolitan Association and the New York State Association. And so we are on the cusp of trying to introduce legislation for this, but so that we as funeral directors can oversee this, because again, we are the advocates for the dead. So the end result of what people call aquamation or anything like that is nutritive end result. So you can go ahead now. Legislation has to be brought in because we have to make sure that whatever we are introducing back into the environment isn't going to, overrun the waterways with all these nutrition and, nitrates and all that kind of stuff. But I will tell you that in New York State and also the surrounding states around us, we are on top of it, and we're trying our best to advocate for our families, because if that's an option that people want, we're trying to push it in a very sustainable, responsible way, so that we as funeral directors could man that, and not the cemeteries or anything like that, because we are the advocates for the dead.
Thanks, Sherry. So in our last 10 minutes, I'd like to move us past this issue and get back a little bit to more specifically the interfaith issues. And we have a question that came in from Richard, who writes, his family is Jewish for 5 generations. His parents, Reformed Jews, had him and then divorced, and both remarried Christians. And he asks, is it inappropriate to incorporate mixed elements in their funerals? So combining elements of Jewish and Christian burial rites in a Jewish context. Rabbi Priest?
Well, I want to make something clear, because I think all of us have been very inclusive in the way we've approached funerals. I also don't want that to indicate there are no boundaries. And I think it's important to say what my boundaries are. I can't speak for anybody else, but I won't co-officiate. It's just something I personally won't do. Only because I'm a rabbi. I can do a Jewish service and amend it in the ways that I think are appropriate and proper. And that's one of my personal boundaries. Another boundary is, and I haven't crossed this yet, but what if they were a Messianic Jew? What would that mean? I know it's the one area where you probably unite all of the Jewish community in saying this group is beyond the Jewish boundaries of what we consider a Jewish community. So there are boundaries. But the point I would like to bring about the interfaith point is, don't think of it as like what is weird or out of the norm. I don't think, in fact, some of the more bizarre things I've seen at funerals had no interfaith component at all. Star Trek funerals, Bigfoot funerals. I could tell you the weirdest things I've seen, but people who belong to the Church of Satanism, which I was very fascinated to learn that they don't literally believe in the devil, and it's a whole weird thing. But there are always ways to incorporate elements from other cultures and faiths, as long as it doesn't feel bad, as long as it doesn't feel like it's disrespecting someone or the service we're trying to bring to the deceased. So I think that there's a lot of ways to very cleanly unite some of these elements. And then there are probably some more stickier points about how to use the word Jesus in a Jewish, service, which I'm not comfortable doing. But if one of the relatives wants to say something, I don't know, that's for them to say and express. That's not me as a rabbi saying. So I'd be okay with that. And that has come up where, it was a very traditional Jewish family. One of the brothers had converted to Christianity, was very evangelical, wanted to bring this liturgical offering. Okay, you're the brother of the deceased. Say what, but this is a Jewish service. Well, I will be providing based on Jewish customs. So it's a negotiation. It's a negotiation.
Rabbi Levin, Rabbi Simmering?
Well, go ahead, Rabbi. Go ahead.
I would just say, I would echo, I don't think that we would have a wake, right? But at the same time, in my own family, we did have a situation where a member of my family's body was not buried for a very long time due to interfamily conflicts, not my immediate closest relatives. And it was very stressful to me. If I had been the officiating rabbi, I would have tried to work through some of those conflicts, because a speedy burial is a very important thing in the Jewish tradition. So again, it's not just interfaith where you're going to get into these sticky situations. And I will echo that I have boundaries. We also had a colleague of mine had a situation where someone said, I'd like you to do my funeral. I'm dying. She said, fine. She said, and I'm doing assisted suicide. And my colleague said, okay. And she said, so give me your schedule so I know when I'm going to schedule my death. And she said, I think that crosses a line for me. But the person did find another rabbi to do it, which, would have been the same situation if the patient had scheduled their death, and then it was whoever was going to be on duty. So there are a lot of things. There are just so many complicated factors that can come up. And I think also each rabbi or officiant is going to have the line that they're not comfortable crossing. And I think it's in some ways it's communal, and in some ways it's very personal also. And it's like Rabbi Pri said, it's very much a negotiation, and not in a haggling way, but in a way to find a comfortable compromise.
Right. That's why we've got 3 rabbis on this panel. Rabbi Levin.
I think that idea of negotiation, you need to know what your boundaries are before you can understand what it would mean to cross them. And so for us, there's a lot of time that we need to spend understanding ourselves and our capacity to do that. And yeah, I wouldn't be comfortable offering up anything that involved Christology. But yes, if a brother came, the only caution that I would have in that situation is what would be the impact of the rest of the members of the family. And if you can navigate that in a way, then I'm behind you and supporting you in you sharing. I did buried a man who was Jewish and American Indian of a particular tribe. I researched that tribe pretty extensively so that I could weave an understanding in the hesped and make proper allusions to that tradition without being culturally appropriative. So I could be respectful in the space and honor who he was and what many folks who were there to honor him believed, and yet, not violate my sense that I have just grabbed some bright shiny object because I didn't know any better and it looked cool, because that's not what we do at all. The one, I guess, that probably has confronted all of us along the way, I walked into an open casket and I went, oh, okay, wasn't expecting that. So I had a conversation. This was in a non-Jewish funeral home, and I had a conversation with the family members to request that the casket be closed before we actually had begun the service. So there are ways to navigate that, and so it was not, you can't do that. But listen, if we're going to say goodbye Jewishly, then this is sort of outside of what we do. And if it's all right with you, and when they hear that, when they hear an understanding or an explanation, they're usually pretty receptive, because again, they're motivated by wanting to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Rabbi Levin. I want to put forth a question about Jews in non-Jewish cemeteries. We got a question in from Patty, who's picking up on a sort of obscure point in Jewish theology, but I'm wondering if maybe this is on other people's minds as well. She writes that my husband and I are both Jewish and have access to multiple Jewish cemeteries, but we've chosen to have a green burial at Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But if one believes in the raising of the dead when the Messiah comes, then will we be overlooked? That's Patty's question. Will they be overlooked? Sherry.
Again, I'm not a rabbi, but decades of studying this stuff. So first of all, there's nothing more green. I don't know if that's nothing more green than Jewish burial. We don't embalm. We bury, like, Rabbi Simmering said, we bury actually in the ground in Israel, which can be rather jarring, but that's Jewish cemeteries are green cemeteries. We use, even caskets are all wood, so that way they decompose quickly, along with the decedent, as quickly as possible. So nothing greener than Jewish burial. But if you are in a non-sectarian cemetery, from the studies that I've studied, Mashiach or Messiah will not overlook you. Again, I'm not a rabbi, and you guys, can beat me up later, but Messiah will not overlook you just because you're buried in a non-Jewish cemetery. You're a Jew. So we will all resurrect,
I'd also add that bodily resurrection is a really tricky subject, even though the Talmud really hits home that we all got to believe in it. But I think we also have to remember that we die in various stages that are not the original state our body came in. And so when you're thinking about it very literally, it's like, well, my arm was amputated and I wasn't buried with it because I wasn't going to hang on to it until the rest of me was buried. Or I die in a terrible accident or in some way that causes bodily trauma. These are all realities in our lives. And so I don't know. None of us know really this cryptic theme in Judaism well enough to say 100%, but I don't think that the concept of being overlooked is part of the theology.
Thank you, Rabbi.
I think there's the concept that you get buried as whole as you can be, but we already know that that's not always possible. So I wouldn't worry about something like being buried in a non-sectarian burial.
Rabbi Priest, we're down to our last minute, so I'll give you 30 seconds.
No, you go ahead. Go ahead. It's okay.
Okay. Well, I was just going to say there seemed like there was something appropriate about ending this conversation about end-of-life planning and funerals on the subject of resurrection. So thank you for bringing us to a close in that way. And I want to take a moment to thank our four panelists for all of their experience and their contributions. Rabbi Paris and Rabbi Simmering and Rabbi Levin and Sherry. And I also want to thank again Riverside Memorial Chapels for their partnership with us in this. And to all of you who joined us today, thank you so much. And we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, Ben. Great job.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.